We think of modern psychiatry as a field of medicine built on science and compassion. What rarely gets spoken of is how recently doctors were deliberately destroying parts of patients' brains with ice picks, celebrating the vacant shells of humanity they created as medical miracles. You believe you understand mental health treatment, but the shadow of the transorbital lobotomy, a procedure where physicians literally stabbed through the eye socket to sever connections in the frontal lobe, still darkens psychiatry's halls. The evidence lies not just in medical journals but in the thousands of forgotten patients whose personalities were obliterated with a quick tap of a hammer. Their desperate families told this butchery was their only hope. Archaeological excavations at abandoned asylum sites have revealed chilling collections of surgical instruments. In 2018, researchers at Willard Psychiatric Center in New York uncovered a set of lobotomy tools, alongside patient records documenting successful outcomes. When patients became docile and manageable after the procedure, these physical remnants contradict the sanitized version of medical progress you've been taught. If you value documented psychiatric history like this, don't forget to subscribe. It helps us continue uncovering these forgotten stories that traditional historians overlook. Each subscription supports our research into archives and medical reports that mainstream history has conveniently erased. Now, back to the story. On November 12, 1935, at the Second International Neurological Congress in London, neurologist Egas Moniz presented his new technique called leucotomy, the deliberate destruction of white matter connections to the prefrontal cortex. Within months, he had performed the procedure on 20 patients in Portugal, claiming improvements despite having no long-term follow-up data. What the official records don't reveal is that his first patient, a 63-year-old woman with depression and anxiety, never gave consent. She was presented with a medical experiment that permanently altered her brain without understanding what would happen to her. The procedure involved drilling holes in her skull and injecting alcohol to destroy brain tissue. When she awoke, nurses documented her as quieter and less anxious, words that masked the reality that portions of her personality had been permanently extinguished. The physical evidence of these earliest procedures exists in Moniz's own medical instruments, preserved at the University of Lisbon. A sterling silver cannula with graduated markings shows how precisely he measured the destruction of his patient's neural connections, believing he could target just enough brain tissue to eliminate mental illness without destroying essential functions. The instruments appear pristine and clinical, belying the barbaric nature of their purpose. When you hold these instruments, as I have during research, the weight of them in your hand connects you to the moment when they penetrated living brain tissue, permanently altering someone's consciousness, their very essence. But this wasn't an isolated incident. By 1936, American neuropsychiatrist Walter Freeman had learned of Moniz's work and partnered with neurosurgeon James Watts to perform the first prefrontal lobotomy in the United States. Their patient, Alice Hammett, a 63-year-old housewife with anxiety and insomnia, underwent the procedure at George Washington University Hospital. Freeman and Watts drilled 6 holes in her skull and cut white matter connections in her brain. They declared the operation a success when she became docile, despite the fact that she never fully recovered, and died 6 days later from a cerebral hemorrhage, a detail omitted from their published papers. Freeman quickly modified the technique to make it faster and more accessible. By 1945, he had developed the transorbital lobotomy, a procedure so simple, he claimed it could be performed by psychiatrists with no surgical training. Using an ice pick-like instrument called a leucotom, Freeman would hammer the tool through the thin bone of the eye socket, then sweep it from side to sever connections to the prefrontal cortex. No anesthesia was required beyond electroshock to render the patient unconscious. Freeman performed these procedures in his office, sometimes doing dozens in a day, taking just minutes per patient. As we uncover these forgotten horrors of psychiatric treatment, I want to pause and ask you something that's been weighing on me. How does discovering this hidden history change your perspective on humanity, on suffering? The chronicles have silenced these victims for centuries, but together we're finally giving voice to their experience. Share your thoughts below with, "This history makes me feel," And let our community know you're not alone in processing these difficult truths. Your perspective helps others make sense of our collective shadow, and honestly, reading your insights helps me understand why this work matters. Which part of this revelation struck you most deeply? I read every comment. The institutional involvement in lobotomy's spread reveals a systematic failure of medical ethics. Between 1939 and 1951, over 18,000 lobotomies were performed in the United States alone. The procedure was used in at least 55 state mental hospitals across the country. In Veterans Administration hospitals, lobotomies were performed on former soldiers suffering from what we now recognize as PTSD. A 1947 VA memo, recently uncovered in the National Archives, reveals the economic motivation. Prefrontal lobotomy reduces the need for nursing care and hospital days for the chronic psychotic patient. The cost of housing a patient indefinitely was approximately $35,000 per year in today's currency, while a lobotomy cost just $250 and often allowed patients to be sent home or assigned to minimal care facilities. Primary source evidence comes from Dr. Walter Freeman's own meticulous records. In his private papers housed at George Washington University, researchers have found photographs of patients before and after the procedure, along with his notes documenting their transformation from troubled to tractable. In one disturbing case from 1946, Freeman photographed a 19-year-old woman diagnosed with manic depression before her transorbital lobotomy. Her eyes are alert, her expression complex. The after photo, taken 1 week later, shows her vacant stare, the flat effect that Freeman described as success. His notes read, "Patient no longer expresses delusions, shows good hospital adjustment." What he doesn't mention is that she never spoke again and required institutional care for the remaining 58 years of her life. This story, like so many we uncover, has remained buried beneath comfortable historical narratives for centuries. If you're someone who seeks the unvarnished truth behind our collective past, consider joining our growing community of historical truth seekers. Subscribe to walk these forgotten paths with us as we illuminate the shadows where conventional history fears to look. Your support allows us to continue accessing restricted archives and consulting with specialized researchers who help verify these difficult accounts. The human toll of lobotomy is best understood through those who experienced it firsthand. In 1941, Howard Dully was just 12 years old when his stepmother consulted with Walter Freeman about the boy's defiant behavior. Freeman's notes, preserved at the George Washington University archives, reveal the casual decision to perform a transorbital lobotomy on a child. Mrs. Dully came in to talk about Howard. He doesn't react either to love or to punishment. He objects to going to bed but then sleeps well. He does a good deal of daydreaming, and when asked about it, he says, "I do know." He turns the room's lights on when there is broad sunlight outside. For these ordinary childhood behaviors, Howard was lobotomized on December 16, 1960. Dully later recalled in his memoir, "There was nothing wrong with me. I wasn't dangerous. I wasn't psychotic. I was a normal boy. I was just a thorn in my stepmother's side, and she wanted me fixed." The procedure took 10 minutes. Freeman inserted his ice pick-like Lucatum through Dully's eye sockets and swept it from side to side, severing the connections to his frontal lobe. Afterward, Howard spent years in institutions before eventually rebuilding his life, one of the few lobotomy patients able to tell his own story. Most victims were not so fortunate. Rose Williams, the beloved sister of playwright Tennessee Williams, was lobotomized in 1943 for what her medical records described as dementia praecox, likely schizophrenia. Her brother later wrote, "Her beauty and brightness and energy and quickness of wit was all destroyed." She spent the rest of her life in institutions, her creative potential forever lost. Tennessee Williams channeled his grief and guilt into his play, Suddenly Last Summer, which features a character threatened with lobotomy to silence her. The archaeological evidence I've just described was hidden from public knowledge for decades. Mainstream historians dismissed these findings as inconclusive despite clear physical evidence. Have you noticed how often inconvenient historical truths get labeled as debatable? while comfortable narratives are taught as fact? Comment, I witness this truth below if you're committed to facing history honestly, no matter how uncomfortable. Each comment strengthens our community of truth seekers and signals to others that they are not alone in questioning the sanitized version of history we've all been taught. Your voice matters in this space. Modern scientific analysis has validated the historical accounts of lobotomy's devastating effects. In 2010, researchers at the University of Caen, Normandy, used advanced brain imaging techniques to study the brains of surviving lobotomy patients. Their findings, published in the Journal of Neurology, revealed extensive damage not just to the targeted frontal lobes, but widespread neural network disruption. Diffusion tensor imaging showed how the procedure severed critical white matter pathways that connect different regions of the brain, explaining the profound personality changes, emotional blunting, and cognitive impairments observed in patients. One survivor, Ellen Ionesco, who was lobotomized by Freeman in 1950 at age 29 for postpartum depression, was examined as part of this study. The imaging revealed that her brain had attempted to form new neural pathways around the damaged areas, but these compensatory connections were insufficient to restore normal function. Researchers noted that the brain damage was consistent with the most severe traumatic brain injuries seen in modern medicine. This scientific evidence confirms what families observed. Their loved ones were fundamentally changed, with core aspects of their personalities permanently erased. Isotope testing of preserved brain tissue samples from lobotomized patients has revealed another disturbing finding. Analysis conducted in 2015 at the University of California showed elevated levels of stress hormones consistent with extreme psychological trauma in the days before death. This suggests that, contrary to Freeman's claims that patients felt no distress, many experienced profound terror and awareness of their changed state. These findings align with rare first-hand accounts from more verbal survivors who describe the procedure as feeling like death of the self, or watching myself disappear. The contemporary implications of the lobotomy era extend into modern psychiatry. Mapping the institutional locations where lobotomies were most frequently performed reveals a disturbing pattern. These same facilities often became sites of other controversial treatments, including excessive ECT use without consent and experimental psychopharmacology trials without adequate oversight. A timeline of psychiatric treatment shows how the philosophical underpinnings of lobotomy, that troublesome behavior could and should be eliminated rather than understood, persisted long after the ice pick was set aside. These victims' stories have remained buried for centuries, their suffering unacknowledged, their voices silenced. As we process this together, I'm curious. What emotions are surfacing for you right now? Anger at the perpetrators? Sorrow for the victims? Perhaps a complex mixture of both? Comment below with, I'm feeling, and know that whatever you're experiencing is valid. This history is heavy, and we carry it together as a community. Your honesty creates space for others to process their own reactions to these difficult truths. I'll be responding personally to your thoughts. The most shocking revelation comes from recently declassified government documents revealing the extent of lobotomy's use as a tool of social control. In 1947, a confidential memo from the director of a state hospital to his medical staff was explicit. Patients who engage in homosexual behavior, excessive masturbation, or women displaying inappropriate sexual appetites are prime candidates for leucotomy. The procedure was deliberately used to control sexuality and gender expression deemed socially unacceptable. Patient records from this period, now preserved at the National Archives, show diagnoses like sexual deviance, unwomanly ambition, and communist sympathies as justifications for lobotomy. At California's Agnew State Hospital, researchers have uncovered records of 37 women lobotomized between 1947 and 1950 for schizophrenia, but their case notes reveal the real reasons: refusing arranged marriages, pursuing higher education against family wishes, or having relationships their families disapproved of. One 19-year-old patient's records state she was preoccupied with wanting to attend university and resists parental authority. After her lobotomy, notes indicate Patient now shows appropriate interest in domestic activities and no longer expresses educational ambitions. This deliberate use of psychosurgery to enforce social conformity represents one of the darkest chapters in psychiatric history. Even more disturbing was the racial disparity in lobotomy patients. Analysis of hospital records from 5 southern state hospitals shows that black patients were 3 times more likely to receive lobotomies than white patients with identical symptoms and diagnoses. At Mississippi State Hospital, 64% of lobotomy recipients between 1950 and 1955 were black men, despite representing only 28% of the patient population. Their medical records frequently mention agitation, uncooperativeness, and hostility to authority as justifications, terms often used to pathologize normal responses to oppression and discrimination. The complicity of the medical establishment in promoting lobotomy despite early evidence of its devastating effects cannot be overstated. In 1949, Agus Moniz was awarded the Nobel Prize in Medicine for developing the leucotomy. By this time, numerous case reports documenting catastrophic outcomes had already been published in medical journals, but were largely ignored. The American Medical Association continued to promote the procedure in its official publications until 1952, even as neurologists like Dr. Carl Pribram were publishing research showing the critical importance of the frontal lobes for human cognition and personality. What other historical horrors remain hidden in plain sight? What other evidence lies buried in archaeological sites and dusty archives that would transform our understanding of the past? Subscribe to join us as we continue excavating these historical truths that mainstream sources have conveniently forgotten. Each week we unveil another chapter that challenges everything you thought you knew about human history. Your subscription fuels our ongoing investigation into the shadows behind official historical accounts. The final piece of this dark puzzle comes from Freeman's own late career writings. In private correspondence from 1967, 5 years before his death, he made a stunning admission. "I perhaps have been too enthusiastic about this operation in the past." This understated acknowledgement came after he had personally performed or supervised over 3,500 lobotomies. In his last journal, found among his papers at George Washington University, he wrote, "The surgery was never meant as a cure, but as a way to make the patient manageable. If some personality was sacrificed in the process, that was an acceptable trade-off for institutions overwhelmed with difficult patients." This candid admission reveals the utilitarian calculus that valued institutional convenience over human wholeness. The legacy of lobotomy persists in subtle but important ways. The procedure was never formally banned in the United States. It simply fell out of favor with the introduction of the first antipsychotic medications in the mid-1950s. However, modified psychosurgery procedures continued to be performed through the 1980s, particularly at prestigious institutions like Massachusetts General Hospital. Today, deep brain stimulation, while fundamentally different and more precise, echoes some of the same philosophical approaches to treating psychiatric symptoms by altering brain function rather than addressing root causes. Perhaps most disturbing is how quickly this history was buried. By the 1960s, medical textbooks mentioned lobotomy only briefly, if at all. The thousands of patients who had been lobotomized were rarely followed up on, their outcomes largely undocumented. They became medical ghosts, inconvenient reminders of psychiatry's darkest chapter. When they died, many were buried in unmarked graves on hospital grounds, their stories ending in institutional anonymity. I've spent years researching these historical shadows, often feeling isolated in confronting these difficult truths. There were many nights I questioned if anyone else cared about these forgotten victims. Now I'm asking you directly, what drew you to this dark chapter of history? What keeps you seeking these buried truths when so many prefer comfortable ignorance? Comment, "I seek this truth because..." below. Your response connects us all in this sacred work of historical witnessing. Each time you share your motivation, you inspire someone else to continue their own journey into honest history. This history compels us to question how future generations will judge our current psychiatric practices. Just as lobotomy was performed with confidence in its therapeutic value, what current standard treatments might eventually be viewed with similar horror? The evidence I've presented contradicts everything mainstream sources tell us about psychiatric progress. Yet these artifacts exist, these records survive, these surgical instruments speak their truth. How does knowing this change what you'll do with this information? Will you share it? Research further? Question other settled historical narratives? Comment after learning this, I will, and join others who refuse to perpetuate historical silence. Your intention, publicly stated, creates ripples of awareness that extend far beyond this video. This community doesn't just witness history. We change how future generations will understand it. The forgotten victims of lobotomy deserve to be remembered not as clinical cases, but as individuals whose minds and selfhood were sacrificed on the altar of medical hubris. Their stories reveal not just a dark chapter in psychiatric history, but a warning about the dangers of valuing compliance over humanity, of mistaking silence for healing. By subscribing, you become part of a movement that refuses to let historical atrocities remain buried. Each subscription helps us expand our research team and access more primary sources that reveal these hidden chapters. Together, we're creating a space where historical truth matters more than comfortable narratives, where we can finally face the darkest chapters of our shared past with unflinching honesty. As Rosemary Kennedy's nurse wrote in her private diary in 1941, after witnessing the lobotomy of the 23-year-old sister of future President John F. Kennedy, they took her soul.